The sun hung low over Bluebird Crossing Depot, casting long shadows across the weathered platform where dust devils swirled in lazy circles. The iron rails gleamed like heated copper wire still radiating the afternoon's punishing heat. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped its evening song to the emptying sky, and the telegraph inside the station clicked its rhythmic Morse code into the gathering dusk. Cora Murphy sat slumped against her stacked leather trunks, her red hair escaping its pins in damp tendrils that clung to her freckled neck. The navy wool traveling dress she wore, purchased secondhand in Philadelphia 3 weeks ago, was wrinkled beyond recognition, dark with sweat at the small of her back and under her arms. Her eyelids drooped, then closed entirely. She had been traveling for 11 days straight, first by coach from Boston to Philadelphia, then by rail through Pittsburgh, Chicago, Omaha, and finally this godforsaken corner of Dakota territory, where civilization thinned like watered milk. Her hands were blistered raw from hauling trunks at every transfer point, her feet swollen in boots never meant for this kind of journey. Sleep had been snatched in intervals, 20 minutes here, an hour there, always jolted awake by locomotive whistles or the shouts of conductors calling stations she'd never heard of and would never see again. Now finally still, she surrendered to exhaustion. A freight train approached from the east, its whistle splitting the evening air, with a shriek that should have woken her, but didn't. The ground trembled beneath the platform boards. The massive engine roared past, close enough that the wind of its passage tugged at her skirt and sent her loosened hair streaming sideways. The force of it should have startled her awake. But Cora slept on head, tilted awkwardly against the trunk's brass corner mouth, slightly open, breathing deep and even. 20 yards down the platform, 2 men leaned against the depot wall in studied casualness. New barbed wire bills so named for the scar tissue crisscrossing his forearms from years of fence work had his thumbs hooked through his gun belt, eyes fixed on the sleeping woman, with the patience of a man paid to wait. Beside him, Scarface Sam picked his teeth with a splinter, the puckered line running from his left eye to his jaw, pulling tight when he grinned. "She ain't going nowhere," Sam muttered, spitting the splinter onto the platform. "Smooth says wait for the signal," Bill replied without moving his gaze from Cora's unconscious form. Inside the depot, the telegraph clicked its steady rhythm. Outside, the freight train's caboose rattled past, and in its wake, the evening settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the soft rasp of Cora's breathing and the distant complaint of a crow calling from the water tower. That's when Wicasa appeared. He moved with the kind of silence that came from a lifetime of necessity, his moccasins making no sound on the platform boards despite the old wood's tendency to creak. He wore buckskin leggings darkened with trail dust and a trade shirt of faded blue calico, or the kind available at any frontier store, but worn with the bearing of a man who needed no decoration to command respect. His black hair hung past his shoulders, bound back with a strip of rawhide. His face was angular, weathered by sun and wind, into the look of a man who'd seen maybe 28 or 29 summers with dark eyes that missed nothing as they swept the platform, calculating distances, exits, threats. He saw the sleeping woman first, then the 2 gunmen pretending not to watch her, then the way the shadows fell across the platform and the positioning of the buildings. His hand moved instinctively to check the knife sheathed at his belt, then to the revolver tucked into his waistband beneath the calico shirt. He knelt beside Cora, movement fluid and careful like water finding its path. His hand hovered over her wrist for a moment, close enough to feel the warmth of her skin without touching, then made contact. Just enough pressure to register. Her pulse beat strong and steady beneath his fingertips. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough not to carry beyond her immediate hearing. She didn't stir. Her breathing continued its deep, exhausted rhythm. He squeezed slightly harder, feeling the delicate bones of her wrist beneath calloused fingers. Ma'am. Cora jerked awake with a gasp, eyes flying open but unfocused, still half trapped in whatever dream had held her. For a moment she saw only a dark shape against the sunset, backlit and featureless, and her breath caught in her throat as instinctive fear flooded through her. "Easy," Wikasa said, releasing her wrist and raising both hands slightly, palms visible. "You're at Bluebird Crossing. Safe, for now." Her vision cleared by degrees. She saw the face angular, dark-eyed, watching her with an intensity that wasn't threatening, but was absolutely assessing. She saw the buckskin leggings, the trade shirt, the long black hair. Behind him, the platform stretched empty in one direction and occupied in the other, where the two men at the far end had stopped their casual leaning and now stood straighter, hands drifting toward their belts in a way that made Cora's stomach clench. Her voice came out thick with sleep, rough-edged and uncertain. She swallowed and tried again. "I fell asleep." "You did?" Wikasa agreed, his tone matter-of-fact, but his eyes never leaving hers. "Don't sleep here. Not safe." She followed his gaze and saw them clearly now, and the way they were positioned to watch her, the way their hands rested on weapon grips, the way they exchanged glances that communicated without words. Understanding prickled the back of her neck like ice water. They're waiting for someone. Wikasa continued shifting his weight, so his body angled between her and the men. Not touching her, but close enough that the wind couldn't reach her, close enough that anyone looking would have to go through him first. The positioning was deliberate, protective, and communicated more than words could about the level of danger he perceived. Inside the depot, the telegraph suddenly went silent. In the stillness that followed, a revolver hammer cocked with a dull metallic clack that carried clearly across the platform despite the distance. Cora's eyes locked with Wikasa's. His were steady, dark as creek stones worn smooth by current, holding hers with an intensity that said without words, "Stay calm. Stay with me. Don't panic." She found herself nodding, though he hadn't asked a question. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but something about his presence, the controlled readiness, the way he positioned himself, and the calm certainty in his gaze steadied her. His hand moved to the knife sheathed at his belt, not drawing it, but resting there in clear statement of readiness. His other hand extended toward her, palm up, offering help to rise without demanding she take it. "Come on," he said quietly, voice pitched for her ears alone. "Let's get you somewhere with walls and a door that locks." What followed happened with the rapid acceleration of a summer storm. The confrontation with Smooth Sam and his insistence on the freight foreman's quarters, Charlotte Whitmore's timely intervention and the discovery of Cora's forged marriage contract, the revelation that Victor Hutchins had filed no territorial records, each piece fell into place with sickening clarity. When Sheriff Rusty Joe tried to enforce his protective custody order and Wikasa's knife stopped an inch from the lawman's throat, Cora understood with absolute certainty that her life hung by a thread. Then the depot window shattered. Gunfire erupted, and they ran. The flight through Bluebird Crossing became a blur of adrenaline and terror. The livery stable where Ezekiel provided the wagon, despite knowing it would cost him the desperate chase through back streets with Cora learning to fire a carbine, while bullets whistled past her head and the wagon breaking apart in the freezing waters of Dry River, while they pushed and pulled and fought the current with muscles screaming. They escaped into the willows, hiding under a canvas tarp, while searchers passed within arm's reach, lamplight sweeping across their shelter. Cora felt Wikasa's hand cover her mouth gently, a reminder to stay silent, and his heart beating steady against her shoulder blade. When the danger passed, and they finally moved, walking upstream through darkness until exhaustion nearly claimed them both, they found sanctuary at Emmett Green's sod house. The physician took them in without hesitation. He cleaned Cora's torn hands and sutured Wikasa's bullet graze worked by lamplight, with the calm competence of someone who'd seen frontier violence too many times. While Cora changed behind a blanket into borrowed men's clothing, she heard Emmett warning Wicasa about the scope of what they faced. If there's organized kidnapping and peonage, there's serious money involved. That means protection lawmen on the take, judges in pockets, maybe even territorial officials. You can't fight that alone. Not planning to fight it. Wicasa's voice came back. Planning to expose it. That night, sharing Emmett's rope bed because there was nowhere else, and they were too exhausted to care about propriety, Cora learned about Neshoba. Wicasa's voice went quiet and careful when he spoke of his younger sister and the one who'd come west 3 years ago on a similar mail-order arrangement and vanished without trace. "I couldn't help her," he admitted in the darkness. "Maybe I can help you. Maybe helping you helps me believe she found help somewhere too." Cora reached across the small space between them and found his hand. His fingers closed around hers, carefully mindful of her bandaged palms. They fell asleep that way, connected by shared grief and growing trust. The journey to Bandit's Roost took 2 days of hard riding through Split Canyon and broken country. They posed as husband and wife, a cover story that required Emmett to forge a marriage certificate, and provided them with the kind of partnership protection that frontier custom respected. The mining camp was everything Emmett had warned: rough, lawless, controlled by the cruel mine owner, Antonine. Hunchback Hank, the supply depot manager, who owed Emmett a debt, provided telegraph copies that documented the kidnapping and peonage network. The papers showed women tracked by initials and numbers payments to corrupt officials' instructions for transfers and placements. One entry made Cora's blood run cold. HF 31. Failed. Reassigned. Debt 1,000. Hattie Fletcher, Ezekiel's missing sister. Then came Charlotte Whitmore, arriving in the night, with more evidence she'd stolen from Smooth Sam's office. Older telegraphs going back 5 years, all signed with the initial RR. Judge Rowland wasn't just complicit. He was the architect of the entire operation. And one telegraph revealed the most devastating truth. V. Hutchins, deceased, claim transferred to RR. Utilize property for delivery station. Continue using name for legitimacy. Victor Hutchins had been dead for 3 years. Every woman who'd come to meet him had walked straight into a trap. The decision to split their forces was made quickly. Charlotte would ride to Raven Rock with copies of the evidence to bring the territorial marshal. Wicasa and Cora would return to Bluebird Crossing to rescue Hattie and keep pressure on Rowland until federal help arrived. But first, they needed the main ledger, the physical record Antonin kept in his safe, the one that would provide names, locations, financial details that couldn't be disputed. The infiltration of Antonin's office in the gambling den was desperate and violent. Wicasa kicked in the door to find Antonin and Smooth Sam reviewing documents. In the struggle that followed, Wicasa forced the safe open at gunpoint, while Cora held Sam at bay with shaking hands. They grabbed the ledger and fled through a second-story window into the alley below. The 12-foot drop twisted Cora's ankle badly. She fired her last rounds to cover their escape, while Wicasa got them to the horses. They rode through the night with pursuit snapping at their heels, and only when they'd put miles of darkness between themselves and the camp did they stop to examine what they'd stolen. The ledger was everything they'd hoped for and more. Page after page of entries documenting 3 years of systematic kidnapping and peonage. Women's names, the amounts paid for them, their assignments, their fates. Laura Renwick, LR-23, delivered to Bandit's Roost for $800. Hattie Fletcher, HF-31, marked problematic, and transferred to ranch work private buyer Red Oak. And in the back, a partnership agreement between Antonin Baron Thomas Garrett and Judge Rowland outlining plans to legitimize debt servitude through territorial legislation. They had everything they needed. All that remained was getting it to people who would act on it, and surviving long enough to see justice done. The attempted rescue at Baron Garrett's ranch went catastrophically wrong from the start. Despite Johan's clever ruse of smuggling them inside under a tarp, they were discovered within minutes of entering the compound. The Baron's guards were too numerous, too organized, too ready for trouble. The gunfight that erupted was chaos incarnate. Wakesa and Cora ran through a hail of bullets, dodging between buildings, scrambling over new barbed post and rail fences that tore at their clothes and skin. They almost made it to the tree line when the first bullet took Wakasa in the shoulder, spinning him around. He kept running on pure determination. But the second shot, the one that caught him in the side, dropped him to one knee. "Go!" he gasped, blood soaking through his shirt. "Run, I'll slow them." Cora refused. She hauled him upright with strength born of desperation and sheer will, firing blindly behind them to buy seconds they didn't have. When Johan appeared on horseback, leading spare mounts, the boy having followed them against orders, it felt like a miracle they didn't deserve. The ride back to Emmett's was a nightmare of blood and fear. Wakasa passed out twice. Cora kept him in the saddle by wrapping her arms around him and steering with her knees, following Johan through darkness while praying to any god that might listen. Johan's field surgery saved Wakasa's life that night. The boy worked with hands steadier than any 12-year-old should possess, stitching wounds and packing them with clean cloth, while Cora held Wakasa down and whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. "Don't you dare die," she told him fiercely when his eyes opened, briefly unfocused with pain. "Not until we finish this. Not until we see it through." His hand found hers in the darkness, squeezed, once then went slack as unconsciousness claimed him again. For 36 hours, Cora didn't leave his side. She changed his bandages, forced water past his cracked lips, laid cool cloths on his forehead when fever made him delirious. She listened to him call out for Neshoba in his sleep, watched him fight invisible enemies, held his hand through the worst of it, and refused to let go. When Emmett finally extracted the bullet from Wakasa's side, a procedure that took 3 agonizing hours and left both patient and physician exhausted, and the old doctor looked at Cora with something like respect. "You love him," Emmett said quietly. It wasn't a question. Cora didn't answer, but she didn't need to. The truth was written in every sleepless hour, every careful touch, every whispered prayer. On the second night, when Wakasa's fever broke, and he opened his eyes with something approaching clarity, the first thing he saw was Cora's face, inches from his own. "Still here," he rasped. "Still here." She confirmed, and the relief that flooded through her was so intense it brought tears. His hand lifted to touch her cheek, his thumb brushing away a track she hadn't realized she'd cried. "You're stronger than I thought. Stronger than you thought, maybe." "I don't feel strong." "That's because you don't understand what strength is yet. It's not being fearless. It's being terrified and doing what needs doing anyway." His hand dropped back to the bed, exhausted from even that small movement. "You did that. You're doing that. So are you. Maybe we're both stronger together." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Neither was quite ready to name, but both understood completely. Emmett's plan for the church confrontation was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Sunday morning, when the entire town gathered for service, Cora would walk in with the ledger and present the evidence publicly. With enough witnesses, Roland and the Baron couldn't suppress the truth. It would become a matter of public record regardless of what happened afterward. "But you'll need protection getting there," Emmett warned. "And you'll need people willing to stand with you when it matters most. I'll talk to folks I trust, but I can't promise how many will have the courage when it comes down to it." He rode out that night to quietly organize support. Johann stayed behind to watch over Wikasa, who was still too weak to stand, but insisted on helping plan every detail he could from his sickbed. "When you're in that church," Wikasa told Cora, gripping her hand with what little strength he had, "don't back down. Not for Roland, not for the Baron, not for anyone. You have the truth. Make them see it." "What if they don't want to see it?" "Then you make them anyway. You've come too far to fail now." Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of high plains autumn day that promised winter wasn't far behind. Cora, dressed in the borrowed men's clothing that had become a kind of armor, strapped Emmett's spare revolver to her hip and secured the ledger and telegraph copies in a leather satchel that she wore across her body like a shield. Wikasa was awake, propped against the wall, his face still too pale, but his eyes burning with fierce determination. "Come back to me," he said simply. "I will," Cora promised. "We're not done yet." She rode into Bluebird Crossing beside Emmett as the church bell began its summons. Outside the white-clapboard building, a small group waited, maybe 15 people total. Johann's father, Marcus, stood at the front, a powerfully built man in his 40s, with the scarred hands of a blacksmith. Beside him were two shopkeepers. Cora recognized several weather-beaten farmers, and Mary, the schoolteacher, with her spine straight and her jaw set. They looked at Cora, this dusty young woman in men's clothes, carrying a worn satchel, and she saw doubt in some faces, curiosity in others, but also a spark of something that might have been hope. "My name is Cora Murphy." She began, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "A week ago, I came to this town believing I was meeting a husband named Victor Hutchins. Instead, I discovered that Victor Hutchins has been dead for 3 years, and his name is being used by Judge Roland to lure desperate women into a kidnapping and peonage operation that has stolen and enslaved dozens of people. I have proof, a ledger documenting every transaction, every payment, every woman sold. But I can't make it public alone. I need you to stand witness. I need you to be brave when it matters most." Silence for a long moment. Then Marcus spoke, his voice rough but certain. "My boy almost died helping you. Charlotte Whitmore risked everything to get evidence to the marshal. That's enough for me. I'll stand with you." "Emmett vouches for her," said one of the farmers. "Never known him to lie." "I've seen the women disappear," Mary added quietly. "I've kept records because no one else would. If she can stop it, I'll help." One by one, the others nodded. Not everyone was convinced, but enough were willing to try. "Then let's go," Cora said, and they walked into the church together. The sanctuary was packed, maybe 70 people filling the pews, their Sunday best, contrasting sharply with the tension that crackled through the air, like static before a lightning strike. At the front, in the place of honor, sat Judge Roland, his silver hair gleaming in the morning light, his face arranged in an expression of benevolent authority that made Cora's skin crawl. Beside him sat Baron Thomas Garrett, a bull of a man with hard eyes and hands that looked like they'd strangled the life from things before. At the back of the church, leaning against the wall with studied casualness, stood Sheriff Rusty Joe. His hand rested on his gun belt, and when his eyes met Cora's, she saw recognition and calculation in equal measure. The preacher, a nervous man named Reverend Paul, who'd been intimidated into compliance by Roland's power for years, stopped mid-sentence in his sermon when Cora's group entered. His eyes widened, his mouth working soundlessly for a moment before he found his voice. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Cora walked down the center aisle, her boots echoing on the wooden floor, her supporters fanning out on either side to form a protective wedge. She moved with purpose toward the front of the church, toward the communion table that sat below the pulpit. "Forgive the interruption, Reverend Paul," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. but I have evidence of crimes that this congregation needs to see. Crimes committed by men sitting in this room. Crimes that have destroyed lives and corrupted everything you claim to hold sacred. A ripple of shocked whispers ran through the crowd. Judge Rowland stood slowly, his movements deliberate, his face darkening with controlled anger. This woman is a fugitive. He announced, his voice pitched to command attention and obedience. She is wanted for assault on a law officer, theft of property, and criminal trespass. Sheriff Joseph, arrest her immediately. Rusty Joe pushed off from the wall and started down the aisle, his hand moving to his revolver. But Marcus and the other supporters moved to block him, forming a human barrier between the sheriff and Cora. Let her speak. Marcus said, his blacksmith's voice carrying the weight of muscle and determination. If she's lying, it'll be obvious to everyone. But if she's telling the truth, we have a right to hear it before you silence her. You're interfering with a lawful arrest. Rusty Joe warned, his hand now gripping his weapon. That's a criminal offense. And you're interfering with the truth, Mary shot back. Which is a moral offense, and I'd say that matters more in a church. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the congregation. Some people were standing now, craning to see better, their expressions ranging from confusion to anger to dawning realization. Judge Rowland's smile was cold and sharp as a knife blade. Very well. Let her embarrass herself with whatever fanciful accusations she's concocted. Then we can discuss the appropriate charges and punishments for slander, in addition to her other crimes. Cora reached the communion table and set down her satchel. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them steady as she pulled out the ledger, thick, leather-bound, heavy, with the weight of documented evil. This, she said, holding it up so everyone could see, is a record of a kidnapping and peonage, unlawful servitude, conspiracy, bribery, and corruption of office operation that has been running in this county for at least 3 years. It lists the names of women brought here under false pretenses, the amounts paid for them, where they were sent, and what happened to them. It shows payments made to local officials to ensure their silence and cooperation. And it proves that the man orchestrating all of it is Judge Rowland, in partnership with Baron Thomas Garrett and mining operator Gregor Antonin. She opened the ledger to a marked page and began reading aloud, her voice growing stronger with each entry. May 17th, 1873. Laura Renwick, age 23, delivered to Bandit's Roost mining camp under false contract. Assigned to saloon operations. Debt recorded as $800. Payments made to R. Joseph $50 and R. Rowland $150 for processing and custody transfer. Gasps erupted from the congregation. Rowland's face went red. That is a complete fabrication, he started, but Cora spoke over him, her voice rising. June 3rd, 1873. Margaret Sullivan, age 19, delivered to Red Oak area, assigned to domestic service at private ranch. Debt recorded as $650. Marked as cooperative. Payments made to S. Samuel $40 for depot processing. She read more entries, her voice unwavering, each one hitting the congregation like a physical blow. Names, ages, amounts, fates, all documented in careful handwriting that spoke of systematic, organized cruelty. These are lies, Rowland shouted, his composure cracking. Forged documents designed to defame me. Anyone with access to paper and ink could have created such a fabrication. Could they? Cora reached into her satchel and pulled out the telegraph copies, letting them unfurl in her hands. These are telegraph transcripts showing communication between you, Smooth Sam Samuel Sheriff Joseph Antonin, and the Baron. They reference specific women by the same initials and numbers used in the ledger. They discuss transfers, payments, and how to handle problems. She read several telegraphs aloud, her voice shaking now, not with fear, but with anger. S. Samuel to R. Rowland, dated August 4th. New arrival CM 23 on afternoon train. Will process as discussed. Advise on placement. Our Roland reply, hold pending Baron confirmation. Use standard debt protocol. Cora looked up from the telegram, her eyes finding Roland's across the church. CM23. That's me. Cora Murphy, entry number 23 in your ledger. I was supposed to meet Victor Hutchins, a rancher who'd arranged our marriage through a Chicago agency. Except Victor Hutchins doesn't exist, does he? Judge Roland. Of course he exists. Roland sputtered. This is preposterous. He did exist. Cora corrected, pulling out another telegram. 3 years ago. This is dated September 1870. V. Hutchins deceased claim transferred to RR. Utilize property for delivery station. Continue using name for legitimacy. You've been using a dead man's name to lure women here for 3 years. How many, Judge Roland? How many women have disappeared because they thought they were meeting Victor Hutchins? The silence in the church was absolute. Even the children had stopped fidgeting. Every eye was fixed on Roland, waiting. The judge's face had gone from red to a sickly pale. These documents prove nothing. Telegraphs can be forged, ledgers fabricated. Where is your corroborating testimony? Where are these supposedly trafficked women? I'm one, said a voice from the back. Everyone turned. An older woman Cora had never seen before stood up from a pew near the rear, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. My name is Elizabeth Crane. I came here 2 years ago to meet a man named Samuel Blackwood who'd advertised for a wife. When I arrived, Mr. Blackwood didn't exist. Instead, I was told I owed $600 for transportation and processing fees, and I'd have to work it off. I spent 8 months cooking at a work camp before I managed to escape. I've been hiding ever since, too afraid to come forward because I knew Judge Roland controlled the law here. Another woman stood, this one younger. My name is Sarah Mitchell. Same thing happened to me 15 months ago. I got away after 6 months, and I've been living rough, terrified they'd find me again. A third woman rose, then a fourth. Each told a similar story: false contracts, manufactured debts, months of forced labor, narrow escapes. The congregation sat in stunned horror as the testimony mounted. Roland was shaking his head vigorously. These women are clearly in collusion, coach, to tell the same story. What about Hattie Fletcher? Emmett called out. Ezekiel's sister. She's in that ledger, Judge. Entry HF31 marked problematic and transferred to ranch work at a private buyer in Red Oak. Where is she, Roland? Where's Hattie? How should I know? Roland shot back. Women come and go in this territory all the time. She's at my ranch, Baron Garrett said, suddenly standing up. His voice was cold and hard. Working off a legitimate debt under legal contract. If Ezekiel wants to see her, he can pay her debt in full, and she'll be released according to territorial labor law. How much is the debt? Marcus demanded. $1,000, plus interest. That's extortion, Mary said. Ezekiel doesn't have that kind of money, and you know it. Then his sister continues working until the debt is satisfied, the Baron replied with cruel finality. The church erupted. People were shouting, some at Roland, some at the Baron, some at each other. The congregation was fracturing along lines of belief and disbelief, anger and fear. Enough, Rusty Joe roared, drawing his revolver and pointing it at the ceiling. The sharp click of the hammer being cocked silenced everyone instantly. This circus is over. Miss Murphy, you're under arrest. Everyone else sit down and shut up, or you'll be joining her in a cell. But Marcus didn't sit down. Instead, he reached behind the communion table, where he'd apparently hidden something earlier, and pulled out a 3-foot length of iron bar, the kind used for railings and gates, heavy enough to crack a skull. Put the gun down, Sheriff. No one's arresting anyone until we sort this out. 2 of the farmers produced tools they'd concealed under their coats, a hay hook and a wooden mallet with an iron head. One of the shopkeepers revealed a Navy Colt revolver, old but well-maintained. "You're all making a terrible mistake," Roland said, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. For the first time he looked uncertain. "The only mistake was trusting you," Marcus replied. Baron Garrett stood up, his face purple with rage, and pulled a small pistol from inside his coat. "I've had enough of this nonsense. Girl, give me that ledger right now, or I'll put a bullet in you and anyone who tries to stop me." The church held its breath. Cora felt her heart hammering, felt sweat running down her back despite the cool morning air. This was the moment, the pivot point, where everything would either fall apart or come together. She looked at the Baron's gun, then at Roland's pale face, then at the congregation watching with wide eyes. And she made a choice. "No," she said simply. "What? I said no. You're not getting this ledger. You're not silencing me. And you're not walking out of here free men." She turned to face the congregation, fully raising her voice so everyone could hear. "These men have built their power on fear. They've convinced you that they're untouchable, that the law serves them, that speaking up will only bring punishment. But fear is just a habit, and habits can be broken." She held up the ledger again. "This book has the names of at least 40 women. 40 women who came here hoping for a better life, and instead found slavery. Some escaped like the women who stood up today. Some are still trapped like Hattie Fletcher. And some," her voice caught, "some will never know what happened to them. But we can stop it from happening to anyone else. Right here, right now, if you have the courage." "Inspiring speech," the Baron snarled. "But it doesn't change the fact that I'm holding a gun and you're holding a book. Which do you think wins?" "Depends on how many books there are," said Reverend Paul. Everyone looked at him in surprise. The preacher had been silent throughout the confrontation, seemingly paralyzed by fear or indecision. But now he walked down from the pulpit with slow, deliberate steps. "I've been a coward," he said quietly. "For years I've known something was wrong in this town. I've heard confessions that hinted at crimes. I've seen families destroyed by the Baron's land grabs and Roland's rulings. And I've said nothing because I was afraid. Because I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere with secular authority." He stopped beside Cora. "But this is a church, and in a church we stand for truth, even when it's dangerous." He turned to the congregation. "How many of you have suffered under these men's corruption? How many have lost land or water rights or family members? How many have been too afraid to speak up?" Slowly hands began to rise throughout the sanctuary. First a few, then more, then dozens. Old men with gnarled fingers, women with work-hardened hands, even some children who'd learned grief too young. "Then speak now," Reverend Paul said. "Tell the truth, all of it." And they did. One by one, people stood and testified. Farmers talked about creeks diverted and water rights stolen. Shopkeepers described being forced to pay protection money to avoid mysterious fires. A widow told of her husband dying in a suspicious accident after he'd tried to file a formal complaint against the Baron. Each testimony added weight to the scales, shifted the balance of power in the room. Baron Garrett's gun wavered. He looked around the church at the rising tide of anger and realized, perhaps for the first time, that he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "This is a mob," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're going to let a mob dispense justice?" "No," said Marcus. "We're going to let the truth dispense justice. There's a difference." Rusty Joe, still holding his revolver, but looking increasingly uncertain, spoke up. "Even if everything she says is true, you can't just take the law into your own hands. There are procedures. Procedures that you corrupted. Mary interrupted. Every complaint filed you buried. Every witness who came forward you intimidated. The procedures only work if the people enforcing them are honest. You're not. So what do you propose? Rusty Joe asked. You gonna hang us right here in the church? No. Cora said firmly. We're going to hold you here until the territorial marshal arrives. Charlotte Whitmore rode to Raven Rock 2 days ago with copies of this evidence. She'll be back with federal authority. You'll get a trial. A real trial in a real court with a real judge who isn't on the Baron's payroll. You're bluffing, Roland said, but his voice was shaky. Charlotte Whitmore is just a schoolteacher. She has no authority to summon marshals. She has authority as a citizen to report crimes, Reverend Paul said. And she has credibility because everyone in this town knows she's honest. Unlike you. The Baron's hand tightened on his pistol. I'm not waiting around to be arrested. I'm walking out of here, and if anyone tries to stop me, I'll shoot them. He took a step toward the aisle. Marcus moved to block him, iron bar raised. Don't, the Baron warned. Can't let you leave, Marcus replied. Time seemed to slow. Cora saw the Baron's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Marcus shift his weight to swing the bar, saw Rusty Joe's indecision written across his face. Then a gunshot cracked, but not from the Baron's pistol. The shopkeeper with the Navy Colt had fired into the ceiling, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Next one goes into the floor at your feet, Baron, he said calmly. Drop the weapon. The Baron hesitated, weighing his options. He was one man with a small pistol against a room full of angry people, some of whom were now armed. The odds of violence were suddenly not in his favor. Drop it, Marcus repeated, or we'll take it from you. Your choice. Slowly, reluctantly, the Baron set his pistol on the pew beside him and raised his hands. Rusty Joe looked at his own drawn revolver, then at the crowd, then carefully lowered it. This is still illegal detention, he said, but there was no force behind the words. Then we'll add it to our list of crimes, Emmett said dryly. Right below yours? 2 farmers moved forward with rope they'd brought. Apparently they'd planned for this possibility, and began tying the Baron's hands behind his back. He struggled briefly, but Marcus's iron bar hovering near his skull convinced him to stop. Judge Roland tried to bolt for the side door. He made it 3 steps before a farmer's wife, a stout woman named Mrs. Henderson, who'd lost her farm to the Baron's fences, stuck out her foot and tripped him. He went down hard, his silver hair coming loose from its pomade dignity, shattering on the wooden floor. They hauled him up and bound his hands as well, though he protested the entire time. This is outrageous. I'm a territorial judge. You have no authority. You were a territorial judge, Cora corrected. I suspect that appointment will be revoked once the marshal sees this ledger, along with whatever deal you made to get appointed in the first place. Rusty Joe surrendered without a fight, handing over his revolver and allowing himself to be tied. He looked tired more than anything else, like a man who'd known this day would come eventually and was almost relieved it had finally arrived. What now? Someone asked from the congregation. Now we wait, Reverend Paul said. And while we wait, we pray. For justice, for the women who suffered, and for the courage to do better. They moved the 3 bound men to the front of the church, where everyone could watch them. Marcus and 3 other armed men volunteered to stand guard. The rest of the congregation settled back into the pews, though no one seemed inclined to leave. The atmosphere was strange, part fear, part exhilaration, part disbelief at what they'd just done. Cora sank down onto the communion table steps, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation drained away, leaving her hollow and shaking. Mary sat down beside her, offering a hand to steady her. You did it. Mary said quietly. We did it, Cora corrected. I couldn't have without all of you. Still, you started it. You had the courage to speak up first. They sat together as the morning sun climbed higher, streaming through the church windows and illuminating dust motes in the air. People talked in quiet groups, processing what had happened, what it meant, what would come next. The women who testified about their own kidnapping and peonage experiences clustered together, finding comfort in shared experience. Around noon, someone brought food, bread and cheese and cold chicken from the Sunday dinner they'd planned to eat after service. People shared it around an impromptu communion of survival and hope. The children who'd been remarkably quiet throughout the crisis began to fidget and play in the aisles. Their laughter was strange counterpoint to the bound men at the front, but also somehow right a reminder of why any of this mattered. It was early afternoon when the sound of horses carried through the open church doors. Multiple riders coming fast. Marcus and his guards tensed hands, moving to weapons. But it wasn't an attack. It was Charlotte Whitmore riding at the head of a group of 5 mounted men wearing federal badges. The territorial marshal had arrived. Marshal Warren Hodges was a lean man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much frontier violence to be shocked by anything. He dismounted, looked at the gathered crowd, at the bound men, at Cora, holding the ledger, and nodded slowly. Mrs. Whitmore briefed me on the situation. He said, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. I see you've been busy in my absence. We had to hold them, Marcus said. They were trying to leave? Citizen's arrest, the marshal said. Legal under territorial code if you had probable cause. From what Mrs. Whitmore showed me, you had plenty. He walked up to Roland. Judge Roland. Or should I say former Judge Roland, since your appointment was suspended this morning by federal order. You're under arrest for kidnapping and peonage, unlawful servitude, conspiracy, bribery, and corruption of office, conspiracy, bribery, corruption of office, and about a dozen other charges I'll be adding once I review the evidence. He turned to the Baron and Rusty Joe. Same goes for you two. You have the right to territorial trial, though, given the circumstances, I suspect this will be elevated to federal court. This is mob justice. Roland spat. These people detained us illegally. These people stopped you from fleeing prosecution, the marshal corrected. There's a difference. A fine one, maybe, but enough. He looked at Cora. You must be Miss Murphy. Mrs. Whitmore says you're the one who gathered most of this evidence. I had help, Cora said, standing up on shaky legs. A lot of help. I'll need your full testimony and access to that ledger. But first, he turned back to address the congregation. I'm going to be conducting a formal investigation into these allegations. That means I'll need statements from anyone with information about this kidnapping and peonage operation, about corruption in the local government, about any crimes committed by these men or their associates. It also means some of you might be called as witnesses in federal court. I can't promise it'll be easy or quick. But I can promise that the law, real law, not the corrupted version you've been living under, will be applied fairly. There was a murmur of acknowledgement, tentative hope mingling with lingering fear. The marshal's deputies took custody of Roland the Baron and Rusty Joe, loading them onto horses with hands still bound. As they prepared to ride out, Roland looked back at Cora with pure hatred burning in his eyes. You've made powerful enemies, girl, he said. No, Cora replied. I've made powerful enemies powerless. There's a difference. They watched the marshal's group ride away toward Raven Rock, taking the 3 architects of the kidnapping and peonage operation with them. As the dust settled, someone in the congregation started singing a hymn of thanksgiving, that Cora didn't know the words to, but hummed along with anyway. Charlotte appeared at her side, looking exhausted but triumphant. "You did it without me," she said. "We did it together," Cora said. "Your evidence, my evidence, their testimony, all of it mattered. All of it was necessary." "The marshal wants to raid the Baron's ranch today," Charlotte said. "Free the women still being held there. He asked if you wanted to come." "Yes," Cora said immediately. "But first, I need to check on someone." She borrowed a horse from Marcus and rode back to Emmett's homestead at a pace somewhere between urgency and exhaustion. When she pushed open the door to the sod house, Wicasa was sitting up in bed, awake and alert, with Johann hovering nearby, looking relieved. "You're alive," Wicasa said, and the raw emotion in those two words made Cora's throat tight. "I'm alive," she confirmed. "We all are. And they're arrested Roland, the Baron, Rusty Joe. The marshal has them. It's over." Wicasa closed his eyes briefly, and she saw his lips move in what might have been prayer or simply relief. When he opened them again, they were bright with tears he refused to let fall. "Tell me everything," he said. So she did, sitting on the edge of the bed and recounting the entire confrontation, while Johann listened with wide eyes and Wicasa held her hand like an anchor. She told him about the congregation's testimony about Marcus and the others standing armed against the Baron's gun, about Reverend Paul finding his courage, about the moment when the tide turned and justice became inevitable. "I wish I'd been there," Wicasa said when she finished. "You were," Cora replied. "Everything you taught me about being brave when terrified, about not backing down, about believing I was stronger than I thought, that was there with me. You were there." His hand tightened on hers. "What happens now?" "Now we finish it. The marshal's raiding the Baron's ranch to free the women still being held. I'm going with him. And then—" She paused. "Then I'm coming back here. To you. And we're going to figure out what comes next. Together." "Together?" Wicasa repeated and smiled, despite the pain still etched in his face. "I like the sound of that." The raid on Baron Garrett's ranch happened at sunset, when long shadows provided cover and the day shift guards were changing. Marshal Hodges led 20 men, his deputies volunteers from town, including Marcus and several farmers, and Cora riding despite her injured ankle that still throbbed with every movement. The ranch guards, seeing federal badges and overwhelming numbers, surrendered without a fight. They were working men, not ideologues, and without the Baron to pay them, they had no reason to die defending his crimes. Cora found Hattie Fletcher in a locked room on the second floor of the main house, just as the ledger had indicated. She was thin, bruised, with eyes that had seen too much cruelty but alive. When Cora explained who she was and why she was there, Hattie collapsed into sobs that shook her whole body. "I knew Ezekiel wouldn't forget me," she kept saying. "I knew he wouldn't stop looking." They found 6 other women at the ranch, all held under manufactured debts and working conditions that were slavery in everything but name. 2 more were located at a work camp associated with the ranch brought in on the marshal's orders. Each had a story similar to Cora's: false contracts, dead or non-existent husbands, systematic exploitation. None were in good physical condition. Malnutrition, overwork, and abuse had taken their toll. But all were alive, and all were, as of that sunset, free. The women were brought to the church, which had transformed into an impromptu shelter. Charlotte and Mary had organized the townswomen to provide food, clean clothes, and medical care. A doctor from the next county over, summoned by messenger that morning, arrived to treat injuries and check for illness. Cora helped where she could, but mainly she bore witness. She listened to their stories, held their hands when the memories became too much promised them that the men who'd done this would face justice. "Will it be enough?" one woman asked her. "Putting them in prison, will that make up for what they took from us?" "No," Cora said honestly. "Nothing can give you back the time they stole. But it can stop them from taking any more. And sometimes that has to be enough." The trials took place in Raven Rock 6 weeks later in the territorial courthouse, with a federal judge presiding. The proceedings lasted for 3 days with testimony from Cora Charlotte Hattie, the other rescued women, and dozens of Bluebird Crossing residents who detailed years of corruption and abuse. The ledger was entered as evidence, each page entered into evidence and copied by the court clerk. Telegraph logs certified by the telegraph office. The telegraphs were authenticated by the telegraph company. Financial records subpoenaed from banks showed payments matching the ledger's entries. The defense attorneys brought in from Denver at considerable expense tried every argument. They claimed the ledger was forged, and the telegraphs were taken out of context, the women were lying for financial gain, and the whole thing was a conspiracy orchestrated by business rivals. None of it worked. The evidence was too substantial, too carefully documented, too obviously authentic. Judge Roland Rowland was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Baron Thomas Garrett received 15 years. Sheriff Russell Joseph got 10 years and permanent removal from any law enforcement position. Smooth Sam Samuel, who'd cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for leniency, received 5 years and had to testify against his former associates. Gregor Antonin, the mining camp owner, had fled before he could be arrested. Federal marshals were still searching, but rumors placed him in Mexico or California, living under an assumed name. The territorial government, deeply embarrassed by the scandal, passed new legislation, mandatory registration and verification of all mail-order marriage contracts, oversight committees for labor arrangements, and harsher penalties for kidnapping and peonage, unlawful servitude, conspiracy, bribery, and corruption of office. It wasn't perfect, no law ever was, but it was a start. When the trials ended and the sentences were handed down, Cora found herself standing outside the courthouse in autumn sunlight that seemed brighter than it had any right to be. The weight she'd been carrying for weeks lifted slightly, not gone, but more bearable. Wicasa was waiting for her, leaning on a walking stick he'd need for another month until his side finished healing. He'd insisted on attending the trial, despite Emmett's protests. Sitting in the gallery for all 3 days with his jaw set against pain, he refused to acknowledge. "It's done," Cora said. "It's done," he agreed. They started walking, no particular destination in mind, just moving through the unfamiliar town and processing everything that had happened. "I have news," Wicasa said after they'd walked for a while. "The territorial government is paying bounties for breaking up the kidnapping and peonage ring. They're splitting it among everyone who helped you, me, Charlotte Emmett, Marcus Mary, even Johann. Your share is $600. Cora stopped walking. $600. Enough for a stake. Land, livestock, starting a business, whatever you choose. He pulled a bank draft from his coat pocket and handed it to her. She stared at the number, more money than she'd ever imagined possessing. "What are you going to do with your share? Already bought land," Wicasa said. "Plot near Dry River, good water, decent grazing. Thought I'd build a cabin, maybe run a legitimate scouting operation. Help people who actually need help instead of..." He gestured vaguely at the courthouse behind them. "All this. That sounds good." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "There's room for a partner, if you're interested. Separate quarters at first, professional arrangement, but..." He trailed off, clearly struggling with how to say what he meant. Cora decided to help him, but with the possibility of more. "If we both want that." "Yes, exactly that." He looked at her directly, his dark eyes serious. these past weeks running and fighting and nearly dying, it showed me something. Showed me that I'm better when you're with me. Stronger, smarter, more certain of what matters. And I hope, maybe you feel something similar. Cora thought about the moment on the rope bed at Emmett's house when she'd reached for his hand in the darkness and he'd held on like a lifeline. She thought about watching him nearly die and realizing that the terror she felt wasn't just about losing an ally, but about losing him specifically, his quiet strength, his unexpected humor, his way of seeing her as capable even when she doubted herself. I do feel something similar, she said quietly. More than similar, actually. So that's a yes to the partnership, the land, the possibility of more. That's a yes, Cora confirmed. To all of it. He pulled her close, carefully mindful of healing injuries on both sides, and kissed her. It was gentle, almost tentative, the kiss of two people who'd been through hell together and were choosing to build something new from the ashes. When they broke apart, both were smiling. There's one more thing, Wakasa said. Something I didn't want to tell you until after the trial, in case it was false hope. What is it? Emmett got a letter from Colorado. His voice was shaking slightly. From Neshoba. Cora's breath caught. Your sister. She's alive. She escaped from whatever situation she was in about 2 years ago, made her way to Colorado, and has been teaching at a school there under a different name, trying to stay hidden from whoever took her. Emmett's brother met her by chance, recognized her from my description, and convinced her it was safe to reach out. He pulled out a folded letter, his hands trembling. She wants to see me. To see us, actually. She wants to meet the woman who helped shut down the operation she barely escaped from. Tears were running down Cora's face before she realized she was crying. When can we go? Soon as you're ready. Maybe early spring after we've built the cabin and settled the land. Give us both time to heal properly first. They made that journey in April, when the high plains turned briefly green and wildflowers dotted the prairie like scattered jewels. The ride to Colorado took 8 days, and Cora spent them learning the skills Wakasa had mastered, tracking, reading weather, living off the land. Neshoba met them outside the small schoolhouse where she taught, and Cora watched brother and sister fall into each other's arms with the kind of reunion that needed no words. Later, around a fire with Neshoba's husband, a gentle man who worked the railroad, and their young daughter, they shared stories. Neshoba's experience had been different from the Bluebird crossing operation, but rooted in the same evil false contracts, manufactured debts, isolation, and exploitation. She'd escaped by stealing a horse and riding 3 days without stopping, until she reached a town where no one knew her. She'd been hiding ever since, terrified of being found. But you weren't hiding, she said to Cora. You stood up. You fought back. You gave me hope that maybe it's finally safe to stop running. It's safer, Cora replied. Not perfect, but safer. The laws are changing. People are watching now. It won't be as easy for them to do what they did. They stayed for a week, building connections and healing old wounds. When they finally rode back to Nebraska, Cora felt like she was carrying something precious, not just the knowledge that Neshoba had survived, but the understanding that even the darkest situations could be overcome, that family could be found in unexpected places, that hope was more resilient than despair. The cabin at Dry River was finished by summer. It was simple but solid, with good timber walls and a stone fireplace that Wakasa had built himself with Marcus's help. 2 rooms that became one as professional partnership evolved into something deeper, more permanent. They built their scouting business, slowly taking jobs that mattered, escorting travelers who needed protection, tracking missing persons, investigating situations that seemed suspicious. Word spread that they could be trusted, that they'd stand up to corruption even when it was dangerous. Hattie Fletcher opened her boarding house in Bluebird Crossing, a place specifically designed for women traveling alone. She worked with Mary to run a literacy program and a verification service. Women could come there to check if their marriage contracts were legitimate, if the men they were supposed to meet actually existed, if the promises made were legal or fraudulent. Charlotte Whitmore became Territorial Education Inspector, traveling from town to town and using her position to watch for signs of kidnapping and peonage or exploitation. She worked with Cora and Wicasa, providing information about suspicious situations and helping build cases against people who preyed on the vulnerable. The way Station built on Emmett's property after his death that winter, he'd caught pneumonia treating an outbreak in a mining camp, became a sanctuary, a place where women could rest safely, verify arrangements, and get help if needed. They named it Emmett Station. And a small marker by the door listed the names of everyone he'd helped over his long career as a frontier physician. And Cora Murphy, who'd come west with nothing but a forged contract and desperate hope, became Cora Wicasa Scout Advocate and living proof that one person speaking truth could change everything. She never forgot the moment she'd fallen asleep at Bluebird Crossing Depot, exhausted and alone and vulnerable. Never forgot the gentle touch on her wrist that woke her, the quiet voice saying, "Don't sleep here. Not safe." That single moment of intervention had saved her life and changed dozens of others. It had taught her that courage didn't mean being unafraid, it meant being terrified and acting anyway. That justice wasn't something handed down from above, but something built by ordinary people refusing to look away from evil. She made sure to pay that lesson forward again and again, for every person she met who looked lost or frightened or trapped. Because everyone deserved someone to wake them softly and say, "This isn't safe. Let me help." And that, in the end, was justice of a kind no court could ever fully deliver. But that made all the difference in the world.